That morning, after another argument with my son about money, I stepped outside and stopped cold on the sidewalk. A homeless boy at the bus stop was turning something over in his hands. Something I recognized the moment I saw it. The watch I gave my son on his wedding day. I found it in the trash, sir, mixed in with some clothes covered in red. I couldn't say a word. I only understood the way a father understands things he wishes he didn't. That what was buried in that bag was not just a watch. It was the truth. The last time I made the drive down Sycamore Lane carrying anything close to hope, the maples were still full and green. 3 summers back, that was when Owen rang me on a Tuesday morning for no other reason than to share that he'd landed a promotion and wanted to treat me to dinner. I can still see myself in that parking lot outside my office engine, off just listening to the satisfaction in his voice, thinking, this is it. This is the moment a father lives for. 3 summers ago. That's how far back I have to reach to find it. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the maples lining Sycamore Lane had already given themselves over to the season. Burnt orange and deep red shades that photograph like something out of a calendar and register in person as a kind of quiet alarm. I eased the car to a halt before the iron gate, the one bearing the gold-painted scrollwork that Owen had pushed for when they redid the entrance 2 years back. Welcome back to Calm Family Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into the story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. When you sit down with a story like this one, what are you hoping to walk away with, a reminder that patience pays off or something else entirely? Drop it below, it means more than you know. One thing worth saying before we begin: this story contains fictional elements woven in for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. I remember thinking it was too much the first time I laid eyes on it. A gold gate. My son had grown up behind a screen door that swelled shut every summer, and now here he was with a gold gate. I pressed the buzzer. 30 seconds went by. Then the gate opened, no voice through the intercom. Owen met me at the front door in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, the kind of clothes a man puts on when he's given up performing for the day. His eyes were swollen at the corners, and there was a tightness along his jaw that I knew. The same tightness I used to find in my own reflection during the lean years of building the company, when the accounts ran dry and the horizon looked like a sealed wall. Dad. He moved aside to let me through. Owen. I walked past him into the foyer. The house smelled of stale coffee and something beneath that, the particular closeness of rooms whose windows haven't been opened in too long. The living room was beautiful, immaculate, and hollowed out. Costly furniture, an orchid arrangement on the credenza, a sculpture on the console that probably cost more than my first car. Everything arranged the way a hotel lobby is arranged, curated, correct, and somehow uninhabited. She's not here, Owen said, answering the question I hadn't put into words. Celeste went to see a friend. I gave a small nod and settled into the armchair nearest the window. Owen took the sofa across from me, perched at its edge, elbows on his knees, hands locked together. On his left wrist, the Rolex caught the morning light, the one I'd given him on his wedding day, engraved on the back with his initials and the date. I had spent more than I should have on it. At the time, it felt right. Something a father does to mark a moment that doesn't ask to be unmarked. You want coffee? He asked. I want to talk. Owen let a breath out through his nose. Slow, deliberate. The exhale of a man who knew exactly what was coming and had been steadying himself for it since the moment he pulled the door open. Dad, before you say anything, how much this time? The words left me flatter than I meant them to. Owen's jaw went tight. He looked at the floor, then up at me. 50,000. The figure settled between us. the way a heavy object does when it's dropped from height. I didn't flinch, but I felt it, a dull, dense pressure somewhere behind my sternum. Owen. I kept my voice even. This is the 4th time in 14 months. The first time you told me it was renovation costs that ran over. The second, a business deal that fell apart. 3rd time, Dad. His voice frayed at the edges. I don't need the list recited back to me. I was there. Then help me understand, I said, leaning toward him. Because I'm trying to make sense of where $130,000 has gone. Your salary alone should... It's not that straightforward. He rose sharply, crossed to the window, drove his hands into the pockets of his sweatpants. His shoulders curved inward, the posture of a man bearing something too heavy for a frame never designed to carry it. There's a lot you don't know about. Then tell me. Silence filled the space between us. The worst kind, packed tight with everything neither man is willing to say first. I watched my son standing at the window, his silhouette set against the gray September sky. And I thought about the boy who used to clamber onto my back at the grocery store because his legs had run out. The boy who made me read the same 3 picture books, cycling through them in fixed order every night for 2.5 years because he found safety in repetition, in knowing without question what came next. I found myself wondering when he'd stopped knowing what came next. I'm not giving you $50,000, I said at last. Not because I don't have it. I want to be clear on that. This isn't about the money itself. I'm not giving it to you because I have no idea what it's going toward, and every time I ask, the answer is different. Owen turned from the window. The puffiness around his eyes had gone red at the edges. When he spoke, his voice had shed the composure he'd been clutching since I walked in. So that's it. You just don't trust me. I trust you, I said. I don't trust the situation. That's the same thing, Dad. That's exactly the same thing. He came across the room toward me, and for a moment the rawness on his face was so total, so unguarded, that it stopped me cold. Do you have any idea what it costs just to keep everything going? The house, the car payments, Celeste's. He cut himself off, pressed his lips together. You've never had to go to anyone for help in your life. You built everything from the ground up, and you expect everyone to be capable of the same. But we're not all you, Dad. I stood slowly. I buttoned my jacket, a reflex from 30 years in conference rooms, something to occupy my hands when feeling threatened to find its way into my voice. You're right, I said quietly. You're not me, and I have never wanted you to be. I took my car keys from the side table where I'd set them on the way in, but I raised you to be straight with me. Whatever is going on inside this house, Owen, and something is going on, I can see it every time I look at you. You are not being straight with me. And I cannot reach you if you won't let me in. Owen held my gaze. His right hand came up and gripped the back of the sofa, knuckles draining white. I don't need you to help me, he said. The words were soft, but they hit like a door being shut hard. I need you to trust me. I looked at my son for a long moment, at the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, at the Rolex catching light on his wrist in the gray morning. Call me when you're ready to talk, I said. I walked to the front door, pushed it open, and went out into the cool September air. Behind me, I heard Owen say my name, once barely a whisper, but I kept walking past the gold gate and across the sidewalk to my car. I sat behind the wheel for close to a full minute before I turned the key. The maples along Sycamore Lane shifted in a light wind, releasing the first of their leaves onto the pavement. I had no way of knowing that the walk from that front door to my car would be the last ordinary moment I'd have for a very long time. The walk back to my car should have taken 4 minutes. I know because I'd parked at the south end of Sycamore Lane, just beyond the crossing with Hartwell Avenue, exactly 4 minutes of sidewalk between me and the driver's seat, where I could sit alone and work out whether what I felt was anger or simply exhaustion. 4 minutes of maple trees and cracked pavement, and the smell of someone's dryer vent pushing warm fabric softener air out through a basement grate. I didn't make it 4 minutes. The bus stop at the corner of Sycamore Lane and Hartwell Avenue was one of those aging metal-framed shelters the city had never gotten around to replacing the kind with a blue plastic roof that had faded to something closer to white, and a bench that had lost one of its 4 slats sometime in the previous decade. I had passed that bench 100 times without seeing it as anything more than street furniture. That morning, I stopped. There was a boy sitting at the far end of the bench, 12, maybe 13, with the kind of thinness that speaks not of a growth spurt, but of not enough to eat. His sneakers were oversized, the laces knotted several times over just to hold them in place. His jacket was a men's large that hung off his narrow shoulders like a tent. He had the particular stillness of a child who has learned that making himself visible carries a cost he can't afford. He was holding something in both hands, turning it over in a slow rotation, the way a person handles something they can't quite place, studying it from one angle, then shifting it, then studying it again. The morning light caught it on the 3rd turn. My feet stopped before my mind had fully caught up with what my eyes were taking in. The case, the specific brushed steel finish, the crown, at 3 o'clock, the width of the bezel. I knew that watch. The way you know the face of someone you love, not by running through features one by one, but by an immediate whole recognition that skips thought entirely and arrives somewhere older, somewhere near the base of the skull. 45 minutes I had spent inside Pemberton Jewelers on Walnut Street picking that watch. I'd held it beneath the display light and asked the woman at the counter to let me see the engraving one final time before I laid down my credit card. Now I crossed to the bench. The boy glanced up as my shadow reached him, brown eyes sharp and watchful, the eyes of a child who had made a habit of sizing up strangers before they got too close. "That's a fine-looking watch," I said, pitching my voice low, "and even the way you approach a stray, you don't want to bolt." His grip on the watch tightened for a fraction of a second, then eased, a whole decision cycle completed before I'd finished the sentence. "Found it," he said. Measured, not guarded, precise. He took a moment to read me, and whatever he concluded seemed to satisfy him, because what came next required no coaxing. "The big house at the top of the block, the one with the gold gate." A nod toward the direction I'd just walked from. "There's a dumpster around the side by the alley wall. Yesterday evening I was going through it, and there it was inside a black trash bag that had been ripped open." He stopped, mixed in with some clothes, shirt and pants mostly. Red stains all over them. A lot of red. Each word settled into me separately, and each one weighed more than the one before. I extended my hand, palm open, unhurried. "May I see it?" He looked at my palm, then at my face. Then he set the watch in my hand with a deliberateness that told me on some level he grasped that what was happening here was not small. I flipped it over. The engraving on the back met the light just as I'd remembered it from the jeweler's case. Owen A. Alderton, September 14th, 2018. My son's initials. My son's wedding date. The watch I'd pressed into his hand 6 years ago. My hand on his shoulder. And something lodged in my chest that I couldn't identify at the time, but now recognized as the specific sorrow of a parent watching his child walk fully into a life where he is no longer the center of gravity. "Sir," the boy's voice reached me from somewhere that suddenly felt very far away. "Are you all right?" I pressed my fingers closed around the watch. Behind him, the door of a small coffee shop swung out one of those narrow storefronts, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a tax prep office. The hand-painted sign reading Hartwell Cafe in lettering that had clearly been touched up more than once. A young woman emerged with a paper cup in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. Dark hair cinched back in a functional ponytail, moving with the clipped efficiency of someone well into a long shift. She pulled up short when she spotted the boy, and every bit of that professional briskness left her face traded for something open and warm. "Eli," she said, "I kept you the last cranberry scone. It's a little crumbled, but it's still good." She held the bag toward him, then registered me standing there and recalibrated, not suspicious, just adjusting. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," I said. Eli accepted the bag with both hands and said, "Thank you, Miss Nadia," delivered with the kind of courtesy that told you somebody had once taken the trouble to instill it in him, even if that person was long gone. Nadia. I stored the name without quite knowing why. I looked at the watch lying in my hand, then back at Eli. "The clothes," I said. "The ones with the staining, do you still have them?" Eli cut a glance toward Nadia, then back to me. "I kept them," he said, moving carefully through the words. "In my bag. I'm not sure why. Something told him not to leave them behind. Something felt wrong. A 12-year-old boy, underfed, wearing shoes 2 sizes too large for him, had peered into a ripped trash bag behind a mansion with a gold gate and registered with whatever antenna necessity had sharpened in him that something was not right. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced a business card. Plain white. Name and number. Nothing beyond that. I held it out to Eli. "My name is Conrad Alderton," I said. "Those clothes, if you've still got them, I need you to hold on to them. Don't hand them off to anyone. Can you do that for me?" Eli took the card and studied it at some length. "Is the watch yours?" "It belonged to my son," I told him. "I gave it to him." Eli dipped his head in a slow nod, the gravity of someone twice his years, sitting with information that carried real consequences. "Okay, Mr. Alderton," he said. "I'll keep them safe." I cast one last look toward the top of Sycamore Lane, where the gold gate of my son's house threw a faint glint through the turning maples. The red stains inside a torn bag. The watch bearing the name I gave my son before he could speak, and the date I had watched him stake his claim on the future. Something had gone deeply wrong inside that house, and I had walked out of it that morning, not yet knowing the half of it. I sat behind the wheel for 6 minutes before I reached for the ignition. Not to settle my nerves. 30 years in difficult rooms had long since handled that. I sat because clear thinking demands that you first untangle what you know from what you feel, and the two were badly knotted just then. What I knew, the watch had turned up in a trash bag at the back of my son's property, bundled with clothing that bore heavy red staining found by a homeless child digging through the refuse for something to eat. What I felt was something I wasn't yet willing to unpack. I turned the car around. The gold gate sat open from my visit 20 minutes before. I drove straight up the driveway, killed the engine, and went to the door without scripting a single word. Scripted conversations tend to collapse the moment the other person departs from the lines you wrote for them. Owen came to the door on the second knock. In the time I had been gone, he'd swapped the sweatpants and gray shirt for a button-down, the sort of hasty change that reveals a man trying to pull his composure back together at the same time as his wardrobe. His face moved through surprise, then fatigue, then an approximation of irritation it couldn't quite sustain. "Dad, you forgot something." "No," I said. "I found something." I raised the Rolex. The blood withdrew from Owen's face in one clean, even motion, the way a tide pulls back all at once, leaving nothing. His right hand shot up and grabbed the doorframe. His knuckles drained from pink to white in under 2 seconds. "Where did you—" He stopped, swallowed it back. "Where did you get that, Haichuaniko?" "There was a boy at the bus stop on Hartwell Avenue," I said. "He pulled it from a torn trash bag beside your dumpster along with some clothing." I let a beat pass. Clothing with a considerable amount of red staining on it. Owen's mouth opened, then shut. His gaze drifted to a spot just beyond my left shoulder. The reflexive eye movement of a mind sprinting ahead of its owner's voice, searching for solid ground. It found some. That watch. He released the doorframe and folded his arms across his chest, drawing himself inward, a physical act of containment. "Somebody snatched it off my wrist about a week ago, right outside the dry cleaner on Locust Street. I didn't bring it up because I knew you'd turn it into a whole thing." "A whole thing," I repeated. "You know what I mean." He shifted his stance. "I filed a report. It's in hand." I studied his face. Over 30 years, I had sat across from men who had devoted their careers to delivering untruths with conviction. And what I had taken from those years was this: don't listen for the words, listen for the scaffolding holding them up. The hairline hesitation before a figure. The slight pitch climb when a story is being manufactured rather than retrieved. "Ida, and the clothing," I said. "The shirt and pants with the staining." Something shifted in Owen's eyes, a small, quick interior adjustment barely there. The recalibration of a man who realizes the question now in front of him is not the one he readied himself for. "Old gardening clothes," he said. His voice had found firmer footing, steadier than it had been half a minute ago. "I nicked myself doing some work in the yard last week. Nothing to worry about. I binned them because the stains wouldn't wash out." A small offhand shrug that was working considerably harder than it looked. "Honestly, Dad, I don't see what the big deal is. A watch got stolen, and I threw away some old clothes. That's all there is to it." At that moment, the sound of heels on hardwood came drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. A measured, unhurried rhythm, the gait of a woman who moves through rooms as though the rooms were arranged with her in mind. Celeste materialized in the hallway behind Owen, exactly as composed as she always was. Silk blouse, dark trousers, hair arranged to suggest effortlessness while communicating considerable effort. She was cradling a coffee mug in both hands and wearing the particular expression she kept in reserve for my visits. A smile that recruited every correct muscle and traveled precisely as far as the corners of her mouth. "Conrad," she said warmly. "I didn't realize you'd come back. Can I get you anything? I just brewed a fresh pot." "No, thank you, Celeste." Her gaze dropped to the Rolex in my hand. Something crossed her face, a flicker so brief and so rapidly replaced by the warm smile that I might have let it pass if I hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of movement. She glanced at Owen, then back at me. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," Owen said too fast. "Dad was just dropping something off. He was heading out." I looked at my son, then at his wife, then at the Rolex, at the engraving on the back. Owen's name, the wedding date, a date Celeste had stood beside him for, a date I had marked by placing this specific object in my son's hand. I extended the watch toward Owen. "Here," I said. "Take it." Owen reached out and closed his fingers around it, and for a fraction of a second something crossed his face that was not relief, not gratitude, not even unease. It was the look of a man receiving back something he had discarded intentionally, suddenly unable to explain to the person returning it why he'd discarded it at all. "Thank you," he said. His voice held. His eyes did not. I said goodbye to Celeste. She told me it was always good to see me. The warmth in her voice was so consistent, so perfectly metered, that it would have read as entirely genuine to anyone who hadn't just watched her eyes find the watch in my hand before a single word had passed between us. I went back down the front steps to my car. 2 lies, 2 separate incidents, 2 explanations delivered without a stumble, one behind the other, inside of 3 minutes. The stolen watch, the yard work clothes, unconnected innocent, each one easily waved away. Except the boy at the bus stop had found them together, same bag, same house. I backed out of the driveway onto Sycamore Lane and turned the car south. 30 years of reading rooms had given me one dependable truth. When someone constructs 2 distinct lies to account for 2 pieces of the same event, it is almost never because the pieces are genuinely separate. It is because they are connected in a way the person cannot afford to let you trace. My son had looked directly at me and lied twice in under 3 minutes, and his wife had stood in the hallway behind him and watched it happen without so much as shifting her weight. I pressed the accelerator and let the street fall behind me. Somewhere at the back of my mind, a door I had been holding shut for 14 months swung open on its own, and I already understood that I was not going to be able to close it again. Arnold Quentin had been fixing watches in the same storefront on Sansom Street for 33 years. In all that time, he had relocated exactly 3 things: the angle of his workbench lamp, the brand of coffee he kept in the back room, and a photograph of his late wife that had migrated from the left wall to the right wall sometime after she died. Everything else, the glass display cases, the hand-lettered sign above the door reading Quentin timepieces, the smell of machine oil and linseed that met you the moment you stepped through the door, had remained untouched since the first Bush administration. Arnold seemed to regard this as a point of professional honor. I had known Arnold Quentin since we were both 28, and broke in the specific way young men are broke when they intend to become something temporarily, impatiently, with a fixed destination already in mind. He had been the best man at my first business lunch, which is to say he'd covered the bill when my account came up short. 40 years had gone by since then. He was the only person still living who had known me before I had anything worth knowing me for. The bell above the door announced my arrival when I walked in at 2 that afternoon. Arnold was hunched over his workbench, loop pressed to his right eye, both hands occupied with something I couldn't make out. He raised one finger without looking up, his standard greeting, meaning sit down and give me 90 seconds, which I did. The bench stool near the window was where I always landed. I set the Rolex on the glass display case beside me and waited. Arnold finished what he was doing, returned each tool to its designated slot with the precision of a man who has never once misplaced anything, and straightened up. He was 68 now, carrying more weight than he had at 28, with the kind of white hair that looks intentional on some men and simply earned on others. On Arnold, it was earned. He came over, glanced at the watch on the case, then looked at my face. "How bad?" he said. That was Arnold. 4 decades of friendship, and he could take a reading in 4 seconds. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why I'm here." He lifted the Rolex without waiting to be asked and carried it to his workbench. He didn't reach for the loop right away. He turned it over twice, held it at an angle beneath the lamp, ran his thumbnail along the case edge. Then he did reach for the loop, pressed it to his eye, and tipped the watch face down into the light. I watched him go still. Not the stillness of concentration he'd been concentrated the whole time. This was a different quality of stillness, the kind that comes over a person when they find the precise thing they were not expecting to find. "Conrad." His voice had changed register. "Come here." I moved to the workbench and leaned in. Arnold angled the watch so the light caught the inside of the crystal at the exact angle he'd isolated. There it was, a hairline scratch barely 2 millimeters long, shaped unmistakably like the letter V. Faint enough to vanish if you weren't looking. Impossible to overlook once you knew where to look. "I put that there," Arnold said. He set the loop down and looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face only a handful of times. Across 4 decades, the expression of a man whose certainty about something gives him no comfort at all. The day before Owen's wedding, I was regulating the movement the rotor was running slightly fast, common with that reference, and my steadying tool slipped just for a moment. Left that mark on the inside of the crystal. He paused. "I thought about telling you. Decided it was too minor to raise. It matters now," I said. "Yes." Arnold placed the watch on the felt mat beside his lamp. "It does." He drew his stool out and sat down the way a man sits when sitting is not something he is thinking about. "This is Owen's watch. Not a similar model, not a close match. This exact watch. And you found it where? A boy at the bus stop had it. He pulled it from a trash bag behind Owen's house." Arnold was quiet for a moment. His right hand moved to rest on the watch without lifting it, a gesture of contact rather than examination. "Owen told me it was stolen," I said. "Off his wrist. On Locust Street." Arnold looked at me. "And the trash bag. Old yard clothes. Said he cut himself gardening." Arnold's jaw shifted, the particular movement his face made when he was working through something whose shape he didn't like. 2 separate explanations. He said, "For 2 things that were found together." "Yes." "That's sloppy," Arnold said. "It wasn't a moral verdict. It was the assessment of a man who had built a career on identifying the exact point where precision breaks down. That's someone constructing answers under pressure without enough time to make the pieces fit." I settled onto the bench stool. The afternoon light coming through the front window lay across the display cases, catching the faces of 24 watches. All of them keeping perfect time. None of them able to tell me what I actually needed to know. "There's something else," I said, and I walked him through it, the red staining on the clothing. Eli holding onto the bag, Celeste's eyes dropping to the watch in my hand before a word had passed between us. Arnold listened without cutting in, which was among the things I prized most in him. When I finished, he held the silence for a full 10 seconds. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but of someone sorting through several things they could say and picking the one that would actually be useful. "Owen's in trouble," he said at last. "Not the kind you fix by writing a check. No. The kind where someone else has their hands on the wheel and he's riding along." I looked at the watch on the felt mat. Owen's initials. Owen's wedding date. Found in a trash bag outside Owen's house by a child hungry enough to be picking through rubbish at dusk. "Arnold," I said, "you still have the copy of my original partnership agreement, the one from when I first incorporated?" He frowned slightly at the shift in direction, then gave a slow nod. "In the fireproof cabinet where it's been since 1986. Why?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," I said honestly. "Keep it where it is, and don't mention to anyone that you have it." Arnold considered me for a long moment. Then he reached under the workbench and produced 2 mugs and a thermos of coffee, the same ritual he had always performed when I brought him a problem worth sitting with. "You're going to need to be careful, Conrad," he said, pouring. "Whatever is going on inside that house, and something is going on, you don't need me to tell you that. These things have a way of picking up speed faster than people anticipate once they start moving. I know. And Owen." He passed me a mug. "Whatever he's done or not done, he's still your son." I wrapped both hands around it. The coffee was still too hot to drink, but the warmth was something. "I know that too," I said. Arnold nodded once and lifted his own mug. Out on Sansom Street, a city bus exhaled at the curb, its doors cycling open and shut, with the indifferent cadence of a thing that moves regardless of what is happening on the sidewalk around it. "Then begin there," Arnold said. "Start from what you know and build forward. Don't let your fear of what you might find drag you out ahead of the evidence." It was the best counsel anyone offered me in the weeks that followed. I didn't always manage to hold to it, but I heard it sitting in Arnold's shop that September afternoon, my son's watch on the felt mat between us, and the smell of machine oil and linseed filling the room. And I understood that the man across from me was not merely an old friend helping me think through a difficulty. He was the only witness to a mark on a watch crystal that was about to become the first solid piece of evidence in the most consequential investigation of my life. I called Desmond Farwell on Wednesday morning. Desmond ran a private investigations firm out of a second-floor office on Arch Street, the sort of operation with no name on the door and no listing in any directory you could locate without already knowing where to look. I had engaged him twice before, both times in connection with business acquisitions, where the seller's disclosed financials had a particular odor to them. He was methodical, discreet, and had no appetite for drama, which made him exactly the right person when drama was already present in more than sufficient supply. I gave him Owen's name, Celeste's name, and the address on Sycamore Lane. I told him I needed a financial picture, bank accounts, credit lines, any debt instruments he could turn up, and anything on Celeste's background that predated her marriage to my son. I said I needed it inside 72 hours. He told me it would cost me. I told him I was aware of that. Then I went back to work and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Not from impatience, but because waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant circling through the same images again and again. Owen's face going bloodless when he saw the watch. The smooth, back-to-back delivery of two separate lies. Celeste's eyes locating the Rolex before a single word had been exchanged. I had built a 30-year career on the ability to read a room accurately, and every instinct those years had sharpened was pointing in the same direction. Something was being managed inside that house, and my son was not the one doing the managing. Desmond called me back Friday afternoon ahead of schedule. I took it in my car, parked in the garage beneath my office building, the most private space available to me on short notice. Desmond had a habit of speaking in the clipped, declarative style of a man who bills by the hour and has genuine regard for his client's time. No preamble, no editorial color, just ordered information delivered at a pace you could track. "Your daughter-in-law," he said, "has been carrying roughly $46,000 in personal debt for at least the past 18 months. Credit cards mainly plus 2 personal loans from separate lenders. She's been making minimum payments across all of it." I let that settle. "And your son." Desmond delivered it the way a physician states a diagnosis, not unkindly, but stripped of any softening that serves no purpose. "Owen has a gambling problem. Sports betting, primarily online platforms, and at least 2 in-person establishments I was able to confirm. His documented losses over the past 26 months come to somewhere between $110,000 and $130,000. The real figure is likely higher. The number had physical weight to it. I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose and breathed. "He's been borrowing," Desmond continued, "from a private lender, not a bank. The kind of arrangement that doesn't get filed with any regulatory body. The interest terms on this type of lending are," he paused briefly, "significantly less favorable than conventional financing." "How much does he owe this lender?" "As of 10 days ago, approximately $83,000. I was quiet for a moment. In the concrete stillness of the parking garage, the figure hung between the phone and my ear with the particular density of information that reshapes everything around it. "The wife," I said. "Does she know about the debt?" That, Desmond said, is the interesting part. He walked me through it in sequence. Celeste had known about Owen's gambling losses since at least 8 months into their marriage, which meant she had known for more than a year. She had not moved to help him address them. She had not steered him toward any structured repayment, any counseling, any formal path out. Instead, she had done something considerably more deliberate. She had positioned herself as the person overseeing the situation, which gave her full visibility into Owen's financial vulnerability and complete control over what he understood about the options available to him. She's been telling him, Desmond said, based on communications I was able to review, that his only viable path is to get money from you. That banks won't consider him given the debt load and the nature of the lender. That his credit is too far gone for any conventional fix. That you are the only way forward. I stared at the concrete pillar in front of my car. Is that actually true? I asked. Is he genuinely out of conventional options? No, Desmond said flatly. He has limited options, but he has options. There are debt restructuring routes, lender negotiation possibilities, even certain legal remedies depending on the terms of the original lending agreement. She has not told him about any of them. There it was. Celeste was not helping Owen navigate a crisis. She was sustaining the crisis, holding it at precisely the right temperature. Hot enough to generate urgency. Controlled enough to keep Owen from reaching for help anywhere, except the single source she had identified as most useful to her. Every time Owen had come to me asking for money, he had come believing it was the only door still open. Celeste had made certain of that. She had moved through every room ahead of him and turned the lock on every other door before he arrived. 14 months of requests, the amounts climbing each time. Owen always arriving at that same strange intersection, visibly in need, yet somehow unable to explain the need, and I had taken that inability for dishonesty. Partly I was right. But there was another layer beneath the evasion, one I hadn't recognized until now. He had the quality of a man reciting lines rather than speaking his own mind. Someone else had written the script. My son had been showing up at my door, my desk, my dinner table, mouthing words his wife had placed there, and I had turned him away every time, watching the desperation compound, never once realizing it was being cultivated, that someone required it to stay at exactly that pitch. One more thing, Desmond said. The private lender the man Owen owes $83,000 to. A pause. He's had direct contact with your daughter-in-law, outside of anything Owen knows about. I have the dates, the durations. Contents I haven't gotten to yet, but the frequency and timing don't read as chance. They read as something planned. I shut my eyes. Celeste was in communication with the man squeezing my son privately in a channel Owen couldn't see. What had been murky was acquiring edges now. Not the full picture, but enough of it. Owen wasn't merely a debtor caught in a bad lender's grip. He was a debtor whose lender was at minimum in part being directed by the woman he came home to every night. Everything you have, I told Desmond. Every document, date, and figure. Secure inbox by 6, he said. Then, in the measured tone of someone who keeps emotion out of his work, Mr. Alderton, your son didn't walk into this by himself. I know, I said. He may not understand the depth of what surrounds him. I thought about Owen at the window in those gray sweatpants, shoulders folded inward, bent beneath something no one had ever meant him to bear on his own. I thought about the Rolex, the watch I'd placed on his wrist on the best day of his life, and how it had turned up in a torn trash bag in the alley behind his house. What does it take to get there? What quantity of shame or fury or sheer exhaustion causes a man to discard something like that? No, I said quietly. I don't think he does. I hung up and stayed in the parking garage for a long while. Not moving, just listening to the ventilation system labor through the concrete darkness around me. I sat there thinking about the mechanics of control, who pulls the strings and from which direction, and feeling, for the first time, the actual weight of what I was facing. Desmond's file landed in my secure inbox at 6:05 on Friday, exactly when he said it would. I left it unopened until I got home. Coffee first. Then the study door pulled shut, phone face down and silent. I opened the file at the desk where I had signed the incorporation papers for my company 30 years ago, where I had sat with my father's obituary on the morning after he died, where I have always gone when the thinking needs to happen, without anyone else in the room. Certain spaces gather significance the way wood takes on grain slowly under pressure over years. My study is one of those spaces. The file ran to 52 pages. I read all of them. What Desmond had sketched out over the phone was here in full: bank statements, credit card histories, the loan agreements with their cold, transactional language. Owen's losses at the tables stretched across 26 months, in a curve I recognized from years in business, the kind that starts as a manageable setback and warps into something categorically different once the person in the middle loses the ability to assess it clearly. First comes the escalation, then the doubling down, and finally the shift, where it stops being about recovering the money and becomes about recovering the state of mind that existed before the money was gone. I moved past those pages to the section on Celeste. Her legal name per the records Desmond had compiled was Celeste Ann Morrow. Born in Akron, Ohio, 34 years ago, second child of 3, raised in a household that relocated 4 times before she reached 16. Her early history held no criminal record. Nothing that would catch the eye. A woman who had grown up between modest and unstable, and who had arrived at some private crossroads and chosen a direction deliberately. The persona she had offered Owen Celeste Ann Fairfax, heir to the Pennsylvania Harrington's family estate in Villanova, a trust managed out of her father's offices in Wayne, was entirely fabricated. I read that paragraph 3 times. The Pennsylvania Harringtons. I had heard that name at my own dinner table. She had talked about the Villanova property with ease. The summer house on the Cape. The Massachusetts boarding school. Not once had she seemed to be reconstructing something from notes she had spoken the way people speak about places they actually know, with incidental texture, with the right amount of fond imprecision. I had sat across from her and noticed nothing wrong because everything lined up and she delivered it without strain. Liars usually reach for one detail, too many, one unnecessary embellishment that pulls a thread loose. Celeste never reached. She calibrated it present enough to register as real, restrained enough not to feel rehearsed. Desmond had traced the Fairfax identity back 31 months, putting its construction at just over a year before she met Owen at a charity event in Rittenhouse Square. It had been assembled with care social media accounts, carrying photographs and associations that matched the story, a LinkedIn page, crediting her with roles at 2 legitimate firms that had no record of ever employing her, and a character reference from a man in Villanova who was in fact a paid acquaintance briefed to vouch for her, if it came to that. She hadn't borrowed another person's name. She had manufactured one from scratch, built it patiently, and seeded it with enough supporting material to satisfy anyone who looked casually, which is how most people look. I got up from the desk and crossed to the window. The oak in the backyard had turned nearly all the way gold, the few leaves still clinging, catching what was left of the light. I put that tree in the ground the year Owen was born. I had watched it go from a staked sapling to something with enough root to weather a hard season. I thought about the first time I met Celeste Owen, bringing her to this house for dinner, the first woman he'd ever brought home since college, which told me without any words how seriously he regarded it. She came into my kitchen carrying a bottle of wine she had obviously selected with some research, and she stopped at a photograph on the wall and said something about it that could only have come from actually looking, not from a polite scan. She asked me about the early years of building the company. Not the broad, complimentary questions people use to signal interest, but precise ones, the kind that require you to have thought about what you actually want to know. And when I answered, she tracked the answers. I liked her. Genuinely. That is the honest accounting of that evening. I liked her. And I buried the faint discomfort I felt, because it was far simpler to approve, and because the expression on Owen's face when he looked at her was the unclouded happiness I had always hoped to see there. 3 weeks later, I quietly engaged a background firm for a preliminary check. It came back clean, of course it did. The identity on the surface was solid. Whatever existed beneath it hadn't breached any database a standard inquiry could reach. I raised my concerns with Owen anyway. He received them as an intrusion. He went 6 months without returning my calls. I returned to the desk and opened the last section of Desmond's file, her history, before Owen. 14 months prior, Celeste had been involved with a man named Howard Dunstan, 58, divorced owner of a mid-size manufacturing company in Naperville. They had been together approximately 8 months. The relationship concluded when Dunstan found that she had submitted a credit application using his company's tax identification number. He declined to press charges. Desmond had turned this up through a source in the Lansdale business community, not through any filing which told you everything about the choice Dunstan had made. He had swallowed the loss quietly rather than make it public. That silence had let Celeste walk away clean and start again. I closed the file. My coffee had gone cold at some point during the reading. I drank it, standing at the window, watching the oak shed another leaf into the evening. She had run a version of this before. Not the same version, different circumstances, different man, different method of extraction. But strip the surface details away, and the structure underneath was identical. Identify a man with something worth taking. Build a version of yourself he'll find convincing and attractive. Position yourself close enough to access what he has. And the moment the risk of exposure climbs too high, walk away. With Howard Dunstan, she had gotten out before anyone caught her. With Owen, something had shifted. She had married him. She had gone further into the arrangement than she'd ever gone before, which meant either the reward was considerably larger, or her situation had grown more pressing, or both. And somewhere in the center of all of it sat my son carrying a gambling problem. He was too ashamed to mention to his own father owing $83,000 to a man whose calls his wife was fielding behind his back. Living inside a house with a gold gate on Sycamore Lane, convinced that the woman in his bed was his partner. I picked up the phone and called Desmond. He answered on the second ring. "Howard Dunstan," I said. "In Lansdale. I need you to reach out to him, nothing official, just a conversation. I want to know exactly what she did, exactly how she did it, and exactly how far she'd gotten before he discovered it." "That'll require some delicacy," Desmond said. "I know you're good at delicate." A brief pause. "I'll reach out Monday." "Thank you," I said and ended the call. I stayed at the window a moment longer, looking out at the gold oak tree going dark in the yard. Owen had been 7 years old when I put that tree in the ground. He had helped me dig the hole, which mostly meant he had shifted dirt from one spot to another and declared it helping. And I had declared it helping too, because that is what you do when a 7-year-old wants to feel useful. I hadn't done enough of that lately. Taken the things he offered at face value instead of measuring them against the standard I thought he should be meeting. That was something I needed to sit with. But not tonight. Tonight I had 52 pages of documentation telling me that the woman in my son's house was not who she claimed to be, had never been who she claimed to be, and had a prior history of doing to other men what she appeared to be doing to Owen. Except that with Owen, she had gone deeper, held on longer, and made it legal. Whatever she was building toward, she was closer to reaching it than she had ever been. And my son didn't know. I went back to the bus stop on Monday morning. Eli was there ahead of me, sitting at the same end of the bench, in the same oversized jacket, working through half a peanut butter cracker with the focused attention of someone for whom food is not a casual activity. He saw me coming from half a block away and straightened slightly, not out of nerves, but out of the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read an approaching situation before it arrives. "Mr. Alderton," he said. "Eli." I sat down beside him, not at the far end, but near enough to speak without raising my voice. "Did you keep the bag?" He nodded and reached under the bench, pulling out a plastic grocery sack knotted at the top. Through the thin plastic, I could make out the dark fabric of folded clothing inside. He had wrapped the original items within the grocery bag without disturbing them, a preservation instinct that struck me as remarkable for a 12-year-old who had no reason to understand why it mattered. "Nobody touched them," he said. "I kept them dry, too. It rained Thursday night, so I moved them inside the shelter at the park." I looked at this boy, his careful hands, his precise way of speaking, the cracker held between two fingers to make it last, and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the investigation. Everything to do with the plain fact of who he was and where he was sitting and why. "Thank you," I said, and meant it in a way that reached past the transaction. I brought the bag to Arnold that same morning. Arnold needed to contact a retired forensic technician named Glenn, who ran a small private lab out in Ardmore and handled discreet work for attorneys and insurance investigators. Arnold made the call while I sat on the workbench stool, and Glenn agreed to turn the analysis around within 48 hours at a rate that reflected both the speed and the discretion. The results came back Wednesday afternoon. I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with Arnold's name on the screen. I excused myself, walked into the hallway, and had him back on the line before I reached the elevator. Glenn finished. Arnold said no preamble. "The staining on the shirt and the left trouser leg. It's blood. A beat. Human blood. Type A positive." A pause that carried weight. "I pulled Owen's medical records from the file you gave me. Owen is O negative. The hallway was empty. A heating vent overhead pushed a steady stream of warm air down. I stood beneath it and let Arnold's words rearrange the picture I'd been building all week, so the blood wasn't Owen's. I pressed my shoulder to the wall and let the logic chain extend itself. Owen had been in physical contact with someone whose blood had transferred to his clothing. Owen had then discarded those clothes in the same trash bag as a watch he'd thrown away in some moment of rage or shame. Owen had told me the clothes were yard work items stained during gardening. Owen was O negative and the blood was A positive. Owen had lied about the clothes for the same reason anyone lies about something that connects them to an event they can't afford to explain, because what the clothes represented was tied to something much larger. "Arnold," I said. "The private lender the man Owen owes money to. I need a name, and I need to know whether he has any prior incidents involving physical violence. Desmond would be faster for that. Call Desmond for me. I'm still in the building." I went back into the meeting and sat through 45 minutes of quarterly projections with the particular discipline of a man who has spent decades learning to occupy two mental spaces, at once the surface one where he is present and responsive, and the lower one where he is turning over the thing that actually matters. When it ended, I drove straight to Hartwell Avenue. Nadia Colton was behind the counter of the small cafe restocking paper cups, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed the same task enough times to do it without looking. She was in her mid-20s with the kind of face that was easier to trust than to describe open attentive the face of someone who absorbs things quietly and doesn't announce it. I had sensed that about her the first time I watched her hand Eli a paper bag. The impression held now as she glanced up from the cup rack and placed me without any hesitation. "Well, Mr. Alderton," she said. "The man from the bus stop." That's right." I ordered a coffee I didn't particularly need and set it on the counter between us as a reason to linger. You work every morning Monday through Saturday 6 to 2? She leaned against the counter with the ease of someone at home in her own space. Is Eli okay? He's fine. He helped me with something, and I wanted to make sure he was properly thanked. I paused. Can I ask you something about the neighborhood, specifically about the house at the top of the block, the one with the gold gate? Something moved through her expression. Not suspicion, the careful consideration of someone deciding how much to give. She glanced toward the door, then back at me. I know that house, she said. Have you seen anyone coming and going regularly? Someone who didn't seem to belong there. Miss Nadia set down the paper cups she was holding. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of someone sorting information before they share it. There's a man, she said slowly. Big guy comes in sometimes, always takes the corner table in the back. Always pays cash. He meets a woman here maybe once every 2 weeks. She paused. The woman is from the Gold Gate house. I recognized her from the neighborhood. Dark hair. Always dressed like she's on her way somewhere that matters. Celeste. What do they talk about? I asked, keeping my voice level. I don't eavesdrop, Miss Nadia said, with a firmness that told me she meant it. But the cafe is small, and you hear things. Mostly numbers, he says numbers, and she writes things down. She looked at me steadily. One time she said something I remember specifically, because it struck me as an odd way to put it. She said, he doesn't need to know the timeline. Just make sure the pressure stays consistent. The pressure stays consistent. What I was about to learn in that room would reframe everything I thought I understood about the past 2 years. Not just what had been done, but who had been doing it, and how far back it all began. Before we get there, I want to ask you something if you suspected someone close to you was working against you in silence. Would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait, gather everything, and let the truth do the work? I lifted my coffee. My hands were steady. I had made them that way, trained them over years to hold still precisely when steadiness was what the moment demanded. Miss Nadia, I said, if I needed you to repeat what you just told me to someone official, would you do that? Nadia Colton looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was that of someone running a quick internal calculation, weighing trust against risk, measuring the particular cost of stepping into someone else's trouble. Depends on what it's for, she said at last. And who's asking? It's for a man who doesn't know his wife is sitting in your corner booth, coordinating with the person she's put him in debt to, I said quietly. Something moved through Nadia's face. The calculation settled. Yeah, she said. I'd be willing. I thanked her, left a tip that said more than the cost of the coffee, and walked back out onto Sycamore Lane. The gold gate at the top of the block caught the October morning light exactly as it had 3 weeks earlier when I had driven past it believing it would be the last time. The blood on Owen's clothes was not Owen's. Celeste was running a separate channel with the man my son owed money to. And a young woman in a small cafe had heard 4 words that explained the entire structure of what was being done to him. Make sure the pressure stays consistent. I got in my car and called Desmond. Desmond called me back Thursday morning with 2 things. The first concerned Howard Dunstan. Desmond had gotten to him through a shared contact in the Lansdale business community, a casual lunch, nothing official, 2 men talking about the kinds of people you learn to identify in business. Dunstan had been guarded at first, the way a man is guarded when he has absorbed a loss in silence and built a wall of self-protection around it. But he had talked. And what he described, the fabricated identity, the slow accumulation of access to his financial information, the specific moment he understood what was happening, aligned with what Celeste was doing to Owen so closely that it could not have been improvised. She had a method. She had tested it, refined it, and arrived at Sycamore Lane with the assurance of someone running a proven operation. The second piece of information was the one that stopped me cold. Fictionalized, I had my financial contact pull the corporate registry filings for your company, Desmond said. Routine check given what we know about her background. There's a transfer on record 40% of your voting shares filed 6 weeks ago, assigned to an entity called Keystone Equity LLC. I set my coffee mug on the desk with more force than I intended. That filing has my signature on it, I said. It wasn't a question. It has a signature, Desmond said carefully, that matches yours on file with the registry. I have never signed any document authorizing a transfer of shares, not to Keystone Equity, not to anyone. I have never heard of Keystone Equity. I know, Desmond said. I'm telling you so you understand what you're dealing with. What I was dealing with was forgery. Specifically, the fraudulent execution of a corporate transfer document using a falsified signature, which under Pennsylvania law and applicable federal securities regulations constituted both a state felony and a potential federal offense. Forging a signature on a document that moves corporate ownership is not a minor matter. It is the kind of crime that draws serious prison exposure precisely because it attacks the foundations of the systems that allow people to hold and transfer property lawfully. Someone had studied my signature, replicated it convincingly enough to pass a registry clerk's review, and used it to shift 40% of my company's voting power into an entity that existed only as a filing. I spent the next 2 hours going through every document in my files bearing my signature from the past 3 years, comparing them one by one against the scan Desmond had sent me of the transfer authorization. The forgery was good, genuinely good, the kind that requires either a professional forger or someone who had devoted serious time to studying the original. There were 3 points where the pen pressure was slightly off, and one letter in my last name that curved 2 degrees past, where I naturally carry at differences invisible to a registry clerk, moving through 50 filings a day. Visible to a man who has been signing his own name for 61 years. I was still at my desk at 7:15 that evening when my laptop signaled an incoming email. The sender address was Burton Lacey's company email. The subject line read, Q3 Reconciliation Revised Figures. The body contained 3 paragraphs of routine accounting language that would have registered as nothing to anyone who opened it by accident. Attached was a spreadsheet labeled Operating Expenses October Draft. I almost archived it without opening the attachment. Burton sent me routine financial summaries regularly. This was the kind of email I would normally route to my assistant to file. Something made me open it anyway. The spreadsheet had 12 tabs. 11 of them were exactly what they appeared to be: operating expense columns, vendor payments, payroll allocations. The 12th was labeled MISK and held a single cell with a single entry, a file path to a network folder I didn't recognize, followed by 4 words typed in the cell's comment field. I did not do this willingly. I sat very still for a moment. Burton Lacey had been my chief financial officer for 15 years. He was 62 years old, meticulous to the edge of obsession, the kind of accountant who lost sleep over rounding errors and regarded a balanced set of books as a moral achievement, as much as a professional one. He had 3 grandchildren, whose photographs covered the entire left side of his office wall. He drove the same model of Buick he had driven since 2008 and brought his lunch to work in a canvas bag his wife had stenciled with his initials. He was not a man who sent coded messages. He was not a man who worked in the margins of things. The fact that he had done both told me something was deeply wrong, not with Burton, but with whatever Burton had been placed in the center of. I routed the network folder path through our secure VPN. It was empty. Whoever had established it had either cleared it out or it had never held anything at all. It was nothing but a location marker, a way of pointing without pointing directly. I did not do this willingly. I thought about Burton's manner over the past few months. The way he had started scheduling our one-on-ones and then pushing them back. The way he stood slightly differently in rooms where others were present, a contraction, a drawing inward, the posture of someone carefully managing the gap between what they know and what they are permitted to say. I had put it down to personal strain. I had put it down to the pressures of a demanding fiscal year. I had not put it down to a woman who had replicated my signature well enough to transfer 40% of my company and who had apparently drawn my chief financial officer into the mechanism. Or had she? I did not do this willingly. Those words in the comment field were not the words of an accomplice protecting himself. They were the words of a man who had been cornered and had found the smallest available opening to say so without saying so. I picked up the phone and called Arnold. "I need you to look at something," I said when he answered. "Tonight, if you can. Bring the 1986 partnership agreement." "What's happened?" "Someone has forged my signature on a corporate transfer document," I said. 40% of my voting shares. And my CFO just sent me what I believe is a distress signal buried inside a quarterly expense report. A long pause, the specific silence of a man recalibrating the severity of something he was already taking seriously. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Arnold said. "We'll use the back entrance," I said. "And Arnold, don't tell anyone you're coming." I closed the laptop and stood at my office window, looking out at the Philadelphia skyline darkening into the October evening. 40% of my company. My own signature rendered by another hand on a document that had moved nearly half of everything I had spent 30 years building. Burton Lacey knew exactly how it had happened. Burton Lacey was frightened. And Burton Lacey had just told me so in the only language available to a man who has been backed into a corner with no visible exit. The question wasn't whether I believed him. The question was how to reach him before whoever had put him there realized he had spoken at all. Arnold stayed until midnight. We sat at my dining room table with the 1986 partnership agreement laid out between us and the scan of the forged transfer document open on my laptop, going through them side by side with the methodical patience of two men who have spent their working lives noticing what others overlook. Arnold had brought his loupe. He held it at the precise angle over the printed signature comparison I'd made that afternoon, tilting it to pull maximum contrast between the ink and the page. "But 3 pressure inconsistencies," he said after a long while. "And the terminal stroke on the second F in Alderton. You curl it inward. This one runs straight." I noticed that. "Whoever did this is skilled," Arnold said, straightening up. "But they were working from a photocopy, not an original. You can see it in the ink distribution. Photocopies flatten the pressure gradations." He set the loupe down. I closed the laptop and pressed my fingers against my temples. The house felt heavier in its silence tonight, a cold reminder of how thoroughly trust can be taken apart from within. There were no shortcuts from here. "I'm going to talk to Bert in the morning," I said. "Carefully," Arnold said. "Very carefully." I arrived at the office at 7:45, ahead of most of the staff. Burton Lacey's car, the gray Buick he'd been driving since 2008, was already in the parking structure on the second level, in the same spot he had used for 11 years. I had always found that detail quietly admirable. A man who chooses the same space every morning has made a private statement about the worth of small consistencies. His office door was open. He was at his desk jacket on despite the hour, both hands resting flat on the surface in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. Not working, simply sitting with the stillness of someone who had been there long enough that staying put had become the easiest available option. He heard me enter and looked up. Something crossed his face, a rapid, layered passage of feeling that a less practiced observer might have mistaken for surprise. I read it as relief followed at once by fear. That particular sequence told me something important. Burton had been waiting for me to walk through that door, and the waiting itself had become its own form of suffering. Conrad. His voice was controlled. His hands pressed slightly harder against the desk, an unconscious anchoring the kind of gesture people make when they need something solid beneath them. Good morning, Burton. I closed the door and took the chair across from his desk, the chair where vendors and junior staff usually sat, not the position of authority. I wanted him to understand this was a conversation, not a reckoning. I got your email last night. Burton's jaw tightened. The Q3 reconciliation. Yes. I wanted to make sure you had the revised figures before the... Burton. I said his name quietly, without weight. The way you say the name of someone you are trying to reach, not challenge. I opened the 12th tab. The color in Burton's face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment, and everything to do with fear. Not fear of me, I was certain of that, but fear of whatever he had been living beneath for however long this had been going on. His hands lifted from the desk and laced together in his lap. He turned his face slightly to the left toward the wall of photographs his grandchildren, 3 of them caught in the slightly overexposed brightness of birthday parties and school events. He looked at those photographs for a long time. Bert, I said, I'm not here to put you in a worse position than you're already in. I already know the broad shape of what happened. I have a forensic comparison of the transfer document, and I have financial records going back 8 months. I'm not asking you to tell me things that will cost you more than you can afford. I paused. I'm asking you one question. Are you all right? Burton Lacey's chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders drew up and inward in a long, slow compression, the physical form of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for far too long and has just been offered by a single question permission to put it down. No, he said. His voice broke on the word like old timber under too much load. I am not all right. I haven't been all right since March. 7 months. 7 months of carrying this in the same building, at the same desk. Parking in the same spot on the 2nd level each morning, walking past my office on the way to his. She came to me in March. Burton said, still looking at his hands, his voice finding a steadiness in the telling it hadn't had at the start. She had documentation from 2018. There was a vendor payment, a rounding adjustment I made on a large contract. Nothing that affected the final figures in any material way, but the methodology wasn't standard, and if it had been flagged in an audit, it would have looked... He stopped. It would have looked worse than it was. Oh, she had the original working papers. I still don't know how she obtained them. I kept my expression neutral. Burton's error from 2018 was, as he described it, a minor methodological irregularity, the kind that arises in complex accounting, that a reasonable auditor would note and move past. In the hands of someone willing to use it as a weapon, it was enough leverage over a man whose entire professional identity rested on precision and integrity. She told me what she needed. Burton continued. She said if I helped her with one transaction, one document she called it, she'd return the working papers and never raise it again. He pressed his lips together. I told myself it was a single occurrence. I held on to that for about 6 weeks until she came back with a second request. What was the second request? She needed me to confirm the share registry update internally, to route it through our systems as a legitimate transaction so it wouldn't trip a compliance review. Burton finally looked directly at me. His eyes were red at the edges in a way that spoke to a considerable number of nights like the one I suspected he'd just endured. I have 3 grandchildren, Conrad. My oldest starts college next fall. He shook his head, a small, bitter movement. I told myself I was protecting my family. He stopped. I was protecting my fear. That's all I was doing. I looked at Burton Lacey. A decent man folded inward by 7 months. Of something he should never have been placed inside, and felt the particular anger that doesn't come from being wronged yourself, but from watching someone good get used as an instrument by someone who identified their goodness as a point of entry. I'm Bert. I said, I need you to hear me carefully. I leaned slightly forward. What she did to you is coercion. Under Pennsylvania law, using documentation as leverage to compel someone to execute fraudulent transactions constitutes extortion. You are not the wrongdoer here. You are the victim of a crime. I let that settle. Which means that when this unravels, and it is going to unravel, where you stand will depend entirely on whether you stayed silent or whether you came forward. Burton stared at me. His hands had gone still. His breathing had slowed. If I come forward, he said carefully, she'll know. Not yet, I said. Not if we handle this correctly. I stood. Burton rose too reflexively, the way people rise when a meeting is ending. And professional habit takes over, even when the meeting bears no resemblance to any meeting they've sat through before. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing, I said. Same schedule, same emails, same parking spot. Change nothing. I moved toward the door, then stopped with my hand on the frame and turned back. Bert, the email you sent me last night. The 12-tab spreadsheet. Burton's jaw worked. I didn't know what else to do. I needed you to know I hadn't. I needed someone to know that And I know, I said. I knew the moment I read it. I walked out of his office and down the hallway to my own, passing 3 colleagues who offered good morning and received good morning in return, carrying out the ordinary choreography of an ordinary workday, while holding the knowledge that my chief financial officer had just told me he had been living under extortion for 7 months, and that the woman responsible was the same woman sleeping in my son's house, who had forged my signature on a document transferring nearly half of everything I had built. Ordinary. The word had shed whatever meaning it once held for me. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began drafting a message to my attorney. Her name was Adrienne Chalka, no relation to Desmond, and she had been managing my legal affairs for 19 years with a combination of precision and discretion that I had come to regard as essential in anyone I trusted with information that could be turned against me. I met her on Friday afternoon at her office on South Broad Street in the conference room, with the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the river. That view had always helped me think. There is something about the scale of moving water that puts human problems in proportion useful without being dismissive. I told her everything. The forged transfer document, Burton's coercion, Desmond's file on Celeste's background, and the prior incident with Dunstan, the blood on Owen's clothing, Nadia Colton's account of the meetings in the corner booth. I laid it out in the sequence it had occurred without commentary, and Adrienne listened the way she always listened, legal pad in front of her pen, in hand marking only what required marking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Conrad, she said, before I tell you where we stand legally, I need to ask you something. She set the pen down. How long have you known something was wrong with this woman? I looked at the river. Before the wedding, I said. Adrienne nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already inferred from the contours of the story. Tell me about that. So I told her about the envelopes. 18 months ago, 8 months before Owen's gambling losses had reached their current scale, 6 months before Celeste had first approached Burton Lacey, I had done something I had not told anyone about. Not Desmond, not Arnold, not Adrienne herself, until this moment. I had sent Celeste 4 envelopes over the span of 3 months. Each contained a different document, a financial summary, a quarterly report, a letter on my company letterhead, all of them constructed with care to tell a specific story. The story was this: Conrad Alderton's company was in serious trouble. A run of poor investments had significantly eroded the asset base. He was quietly negotiating to sell the company at a substantial loss. His personal liquidity was under strain. Taken together across 4 documents over 3 months, the picture was of a wealthy man whose wealth was in retreat. None of it was true. Every figure, every notation, every number was invented. I had sent the first envelope 3 weeks after Owen told me he was cutting off contact, because I had run a background check on his girlfriend. I sent it because I was angry and frightened, and I had no legal means to compel anyone to tell me the truth. But 30 years in business had taught me that the most dependable way to learn what a person truly wants is to take it away and watch what they do. If Celeste was who she appeared to be, a woman who loved my son and happened to have built a false identity, which I had not entirely dismissed as a possibility, she would not alter her behavior in response to financial news about a man she had no financial stake in. If she was something else, she would react. And the reaction would tell me what she was. Adrienne was watching me with the expression of a lawyer recalibrating the legal landscape of a case she thought she had mapped. "What happened when you sent them?" she asked. The first envelope, nothing I could detect. The second, Owen called me out of nowhere after 4 months of silence and asked if I wanted to have lunch. He seemed anxious in a way that had nothing to do with the casual tone of the invitation. I believe she sent him to take a direct reading of my situation. I paused. The third envelope was the one describing the company's sale negotiations. Within 10 days of that mailing, Owen came to me asking for money for the first time. Not a modest amount, $50,000. Adrienne's pen moved. A single notation. She accelerated, I said. Every time the document suggested my resources were contracting, she pushed Owen harder, faster, requests, larger amounts, more urgency in how he spoke. When he came to me, I leaned forward. She wasn't reacting to a man she cared about being in financial difficulty. She was reacting to a deadline. She was moving faster because she believed the window was closing. And the fourth envelope, it described the finalization of the company sale. A specific date, fictional, on which the majority of my remaining liquid assets would transfer to the acquiring entity as part of the settlement structure. I looked at the river again. The water moved south with the indifferent patience of something that holds no opinion about what unfolds on its banks. Within 3 weeks of that mailing, Burton Lacey was contacted for the first time. Adrienne sat back in her chair. She picked up her pen and set it down again, a gesture I had never seen from her, which told me she was recalibrating. "Conrad," she said carefully, "you understand that what you've just described complicates the legal picture. You deliberately provided false information to someone you suspected of fraudulent intent. A competent defense attorney will argue that you induced her into actions she might not otherwise have taken or taken as quickly. I know that. I've known it since I sent the first envelope. I sent it anyway because the alternative was watching my son recede into a situation I couldn't see clearly enough to counter, and standing still has never been an option I could accept." I paused. "I'm not asking you to tell me it was the right legal decision. I'm asking you to tell me how we work with what it is." Adrienne looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen with the decisiveness of someone who has finished weighing and is ready to act. "The entrapment argument has limits," she said. "You weren't a law enforcement officer, and neither was she. What you did occupies a legal gray area, but it's defensible, particularly given that the criminal acts she committed, forgery, extortion, securities fraud, are substantive offenses that stand on their own, regardless of your motive for creating the conditions that exposed them." She made 2 more notations. "It does mean your conduct will be examined if this goes to trial. You need to be ready for that." "I'm ready for it." "Good." Adrienne closed the legal pad. "Now the forged transfer document is our most actionable item. With Burton Lacey's testimony and the forensic comparison Arnold Quentin can provide, We have a solid foundation for criminal forgery charges. Burton's extortion adds a second count. The prior incident with Dunstan, while he chose not to press charges, establishes a pattern a prosecutor can work with. She looked at me steadily. This is a strong case, Conrad, but it requires Bert to testify formally, and it requires your son to understand what was done to him. Owen, I had not spoken his name once during this conversation because I had been telling the story of a crime, and Owen was not the criminal, but he was the center of all of it. The reason the envelopes existed, the reason Celeste had chosen this particular family to move into. The reason I was sitting in a conference room on a Friday afternoon watching a river and working out how to dismantle something that had been constructed inside the life of the person I loved most. Owen doesn't know any of this yet, I said. No. Adrienne rose from her chair. And when he finds out, and he will, how he responds will matter, both legally and otherwise. I stood too. Through the window, the river went on moving, carrying whatever the city placed in it southward without complaint. He'll find out soon, I said. I'm going to make sure of it. I drove home through the early dark of a late October evening, the city lights smearing across the windshield, the way they do when your mind is somewhere else, while your hands navigate from 3 decades of memory. I thought about the first envelope, the anger and fear that had produced it, the cold precision that had gone into the fabricated documents, the deliberate patience of waiting to see what moved. I had told myself I was gathering information. I had told myself I was protecting Owen by learning the truth. Both of those things were accurate. But there was a third thing underneath them, one I had not examined as honestly as I should have: the specific helplessness of a father who had been locked out of his son's life and had chosen to work through indirection because the direct path was no longer open to him. The envelopes had worked. What they uncovered was precisely what I had needed. What it had also done was hand Celeste 18 months in which my son remained trapped inside a circumstance I'd been watching unfold, while assuring myself it was something I had in hand. That is the part I carry. The phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I know the time down to the minute because I hadn't gone to bed. I was at my study desk. Adrienne's preliminary legal brief pulled up on the laptop screen, a glass of water beside me that I'd filled an hour prior and never lifted. For the past 3 weeks, sleep had existed mostly as an idea. I grasped its function, occasionally brushed up against it, but never quite landed. Each time I lay down, my brain would begin cataloging what I had confirmed, what remained unresolved, until eventually the darkness outside would soften, and I'd abandon the attempt to brew coffee and move into another day. The number that appeared on my screen was Philadelphia, but no one I recognized. I picked up on the second ring. Mr. Alderton. Female voice. Young. Wound tight in the way of someone who had gone over their words many times beforehand and was now delivering them at a clip because the resolve that brought them here was already starting to give out. I live next door to your son on Sycamore Lane, the brown house with the white shutters, the one on the left when you're facing the gold gate. My posture changed. I'm listening. I'm not going to tell you my name, she said, without waiting. That needs to be settled before I go any further. I have a daughter. I can't. You need to understand why I'm keeping myself out of this. I understand, I said. Please go on. A brief pause on the line, the sound of someone composing themselves. The walls here are thin. Things come through that I'm not looking to hear. Mostly arguments over the past several months. But something happened 3 nights ago that was different, and I've been sitting on it, wrestling with whether it was mine to share. I decided it was she caught herself, found her footing again. Because from what I can tell, you're someone who's trying to handle this the right way, and I believe you need to hear this. Go ahead. Your daughter-in-law is pregnant. She got it out fast, the way you push something off a ledge to stop yourself from reconsidering. About 4 months along, near as I can figure, and 3 nights ago she told your son I heard this very clearly. The window in my kitchen faces their dining room. She told him that if he moved against her in any way at all, she'd see to it he had no part in that child's life. She told him she already had an attorney lined up. She told him she had paperwork that would establish him as unfit. Then another pause. And your son, he was crying, Mr. Alderton. I have never in my life heard a man cry that way. He kept saying all he wanted was to do the right thing, and she kept telling him the right thing was whatever she decided it was. The room sat very still around me. The furnace cycled through its low, familiar rhythm. Out on the street, a car went by. I put 2 fingers over my closed eyes and held them there. Owen had been crying. My son, the one who stood dry-eyed at his mother's funeral at 11 years old, because he had concluded that holding himself together was the job, and who had kept to that conclusion for the next 30 years, had been weeping in his dining room 3 nights ago, while his wife explained that access to his own child required his unconditional surrender. How long have you known about the pregnancy? I asked. Whatever I was feeling, my voice didn't carry it. I was glad of that. Maybe 6 weeks. She was talking to someone on the phone out in the backyard. I wasn't eavesdropping. Sound travels. Has she had prenatal care? Do you have any sense of that? I watched her come in one day with what looked like a bag from a pharmacy maybe a month back. Vitamins, I assumed. I couldn't make out the label, a beat of quiet. I realize this doesn't give you much to work with. I know you can't go anywhere official on a tip from someone who won't put a name to it, but I felt you deserved to understand why Owen isn't pushing back. I don't believe he's a bad man. I think the thought of losing that baby has him paralyzed. Something moved inside my chest. It wasn't a new idea, so much as the final confirmation of one I'd been assembling slowly for weeks. The last piece settling into place with a weight that made the whole picture suddenly legible and terrible. Owen was not weak. Owen was not without a spine. Owen was a man who had strung together a catastrophic sequence of choices and landed in wreckage of his own making, only to find that the one person who could hold the thing upright was also holding his unborn child as the price of that support. He had been living under a threat I hadn't known existed, one that operated beneath every other consideration in a register I hadn't been listening for. Because regardless of what else my son was, regardless of what he'd become across the years of gambling and accumulated disgrace and that marriage, he wanted to be a father. He wanted it the way I had wanted it the day he arrived, with the same absolute helpless devotion that pushes a person past whatever they thought their limits were. Celeste had located that and put it to work as precisely and deliberately as she had located Burton's error from 2018 and done the same. She had found the one thing he couldn't walk away from and planted her flag there. "Thank you," I said to the woman. "You made the right call. Please, she doesn't find out I did this." The fear was not abstract. It was the fear of a mother living 3 feet of drywall away from a woman she would have to face at the mailbox for years. "Please." "I won't," I said. "You have my word." She hung up. I put the phone down on the desk and sat quietly with what she'd told me, working it from every direction. The way Arnold had rotated that Rolex beneath the lamp, turning it in the light, extracting what it meant. This changed the schedule. If Celeste was 4 months along, the birth was coming in late February or early March, which meant she was running 2 clocks simultaneously, biological and financial. She had to lock in whatever she was after before the pregnancy surfaced publicly, before something shifted in Owen's world. that reordered what he was willing to do before any of the moving pieces she couldn't govern started landing wrong. It also recast everything I'd thought I understood about Owen's silence at the police station. That meeting, the one I wouldn't know about for another 11 days when I'd sit across from my son and hear him say things built to harm me, I would eventually come to understand that those words had come from a man who saw no other way to keep his child. I called Desmond. He answered on the third ring voice, carrying the soft roughness of interrupted sleep. Though his mind was already sharp, the reflex of someone who'd made himself available to emergencies long enough that it had become instinct. I need you to confirm something for me. Celeste Alderton. Pregnancy approximately 4 months. I want a real medical record if that's possible, or at the least a pharmacy record going back 6 weeks. That's going to take, I know what it takes, whatever the cost. A short pause. I'll have it for you by Thursday. Good. I put the phone down and turned to look at the tack board mounted on the study wall where I'd been assembling the documents, the photographs, the notes, everything that constituted the case as I understood it. Desmond's financial breakdown, the forensic blood comparison, the scan of the forged transfer instrument, the forward entry from Burton's spreadsheet, Nadia Colton's account of the corner booth meetings. In the middle of the board, there was a gap, the space where the missing explanation should have gone, the connective tissue I hadn't had. I pulled out a note card, printed 2 words in block capitals, unborn child. Pressed the pin through it. Every other item on that board was a gear or a lever. This was the motor. This was what had kept everything else in motion. I pushed back from the desk, walked to the kitchen, and drank a full glass of water, the first one I'd finished in hours. Then I stood at the window. The October night outside was cold and motionless. The maples stripped bare their branches dark against the sky. 2 miles up that same street, my son was awake in a house that didn't belong to him, beside a woman who was not what he'd believed her to be, clinging to the idea of a child that someone had turned into a leash. And he had no idea that his father had spent the past 6 weeks quietly dismantling everything she had built. He would find out soon. He needed to find out soon before Celeste registered what was coming, before she had room to maneuver before her timeline, and mine collided on terms she had chosen rather than terms I had. I switched off the kitchen light and returned to my desk. There was still work ahead of me. Desmond confirmed the pregnancy Thursday morning, right on schedule. 2 lines of text to my secure phone pharmacy records from a Walgreens on Girard Avenue, 6 weeks of prenatal vitamin purchases on a credit card in Celeste's name. No OB records, that kind of access ran through channels he wasn't prepared to touch. But the pharmacy trail aligned cleanly with a second trimester pregnancy, 4 months along, real or real enough to be used as a weapon, which for practical purposes was no different. I passed the information to Adrian and told her to fold it into the file. Then I waited. Desmond had flagged something else the Friday before Celeste's attorney had submitted an inquiry to the corporate registry, the same one where the forged transfer document sat on file. She had started looking over her shoulder. The Philadelphia Police Department called on a Monday morning, 11 days after the neighbor's phone call. The detective on the line introduced himself as Anthony Mabry from the Financial Crimes Unit and said in the measured, carefully neutral tone of someone working from prepared language that he would appreciate it if I came in at my earliest convenience to discuss certain allegations that had been brought to his department's attention. Allegations. That word was carrying considerable weight in that sentence. I told Detective Mabry I would be there at 2 o'clock. I called Adrian before I left the building. She was in court and returned the call within 8 minutes, which was about as quickly as a person in court could reasonably manage. I gave her the summary. She told me to say nothing beyond confirming who I was and my willingness to cooperate, to answer nothing about any financial arrangements involving my son without her at the table, and to phone her the moment I walked out. The Ninth District station on Fairmount Avenue was a building I'd driven past 100 times, without ever imagining I'd have cause to go inside. The lobby carried the smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the officer at the front desk directed me to a waiting area with the blunt efficiency of a man for whom my arrival was the most ordinary thing he'd processed all morning. Detective Mabry was a compact man, early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific quality of stillness you develop after decades of sitting across from people as they account for themselves. He shook my hand, breathed dry the grip of professional courtesy, and walked me to an interview room smaller than I'd anticipated, containing a table, 3 chairs, a wall mirror, and nothing else. The room's sole function was to ensure that whoever sat in it was fully aware of what kind of room it was. I sat. Mabry took the chair across from me and opened a folder. "Mr. Alderton, thank you for coming in. Unhurried. Even. I want to be clear that you are not under arrest. You're here voluntarily and you're free to leave at any time. I understand. We've received a complaint alleging that you have engaged in a pattern of financial coercion directed at your son, Owen Alderton, including threats related to business assets and deliberate manipulation of his financial situation." Mabry held my gaze. "Can you tell me about your relationship with your son?" "My son and I have had some difficulties over the past year," I said. "I'd prefer to discuss the specifics with my attorney present." Mabry gave a nod, the nod of someone who had anticipated exactly that response and found nothing in it to dispute. "Of course, we'll arrange that." He wrote something down. "In the meantime, we do have a witness who has agreed to provide a statement. A cooperative witness." A pause just long enough. "Your son." The room stayed the same. The overhead light kept its flat, undisturbed spread. The mirror gave back Mabry's shoulders and the front of my face. I kept my expression where it needed to be attentive, absorbing, not reacting ahead of whatever came next. Owen was somewhere in this building. Behind one of these walls, my son was putting together a statement for the Philadelphia Police Department about his father. Mabry watched me for a moment, then rose. "I'm going to get some water. Can I get you anything?" "No, thank you." He left. I sat alone and thought about the 11-year-old who had stood next to me at his mother's graveside and made up his mind not to cry. I thought about the 7-year-old who had crouched beside me while we planted the oak tree, moving dirt from one spot to another and declaring it helping. I thought about the 26-year-old who'd called me one Tuesday morning simply to share something good, and the 34-year-old standing at the window of his gold-gated house in gray sweatpants, telling me he didn't need my help. He needed my trust. I thought about him weeping in his dining room while his wife laid out the terms for being in his child's life. After roughly 20 minutes, Mabry came back. Through the door as it swung open, I caught a single second of corridor, and in that corridor, moving away with the quick head-down gait of someone who has just done something irreversible, I saw Owen. He didn't look toward the door. He kept moving. But in the sliver of a moment before it closed, his right hand rose and pressed against the side of his face. A gesture so private, so unconsidered, that it arrived in my chest like something solid. He was covering his eye the way a person does when they are crying and working hard not to let anyone see it. Mabry settled back into his chair and reviewed his notes before looking up. "Mr. Alderton, your son has provided a statement indicating that you have repeatedly pressured him to sign documents transferring business interests, and that you have used his financial vulnerability as leverage to compel his compliance." Mabry's tone stayed professionally neutral throughout. He was conveying facts, not passing judgment. He also states that you threatened to report him to financial regulatory authorities if he did not cooperate. None of it was true. Every element was a structure built from real events, stripped of their actual sequence and meaning, and reassembled into a shape designed to serve a specific purpose. The coercion, the leverage, the threats, each piece borrowed from the genuine situation and flipped so that the one doing those things became the one suffering them, and the one suffering them became the one responsible. Celeste had handed Owen a script, and Owen, carrying 7 months of fear and shame and the weight of an unborn child, had read every line of it. "I understand," I said. The words came out the way I required them to, level, without anger, without the brittleness that anger would have put in them. "I'd like to call my attorney now." Mabry nodded and pushed a phone across the table. I picked it up and dialed Adrienne's number. As it rang, I looked at the mirror and held my own reflection. The face of a man in a police interview room while his son gave statements against him in the corridor outside. I didn't look away. I had assembled everything I had from nothing across 30 years through patience and precision and the willingness to sit inside discomfort until it yielded something I could work with. I had endured bad contracts and collapsed partnerships and a market crisis in 2007 that stripped 15% of everything I had built in a single quarter. I had buried a wife and raised a son by myself and built a company that gave 400 people work. And through all of it, I had never lost my grip on what I was doing or the reason I was doing it. This was the hardest thing I had faced. Not because of what Owen had said, but because of what had driven him to say it. Because I understood it. Because I could take the full weight of everything that had pushed him into that corridor and that statement and that private gesture of a hand over a wet eye and comprehend it entirely and still know that comprehending it did not stop it from hurting. Adrienne picked up on the second ring. "They have Owen's statement," I said. "I need you here." Adrienne arrived at the 9th District at 4:15. She came in wearing a charcoal suit briefcase set on the table with the quiet authority of someone who has entered rooms like this one dozens of times and found none of them worth fearing. She spoke with Detective Mabry for 22 minutes while I waited in the corridor on a bench engineered for discomfort, which it achieved. When she emerged, she sat beside me and delivered in the low, even voice she reserved for information that needed to travel without the interference of emotion. The following, the department would be reviewing Owen's statement alongside the complaint. Before determining next steps, I was free to leave, and I was not to contact Owen directly under any circumstances until she said otherwise. I drove home through the dark of a November evening and sat at my desk until 1 o'clock in the morning, not working, not sleeping, occupying the territory between those two states that becomes familiar when there is nothing useful left to do, and the mind will not stand down regardless. 3 days after that, Adrienne's assistant reached me at 8:15 in the morning with a message 2 people had come to Adrienne's office asking for me by name, a young man and a woman. The young man had something he wanted to hand over. I was there in 20 minutes. Eli was sitting in one of the chairs in Adrienne's waiting area, spine straight, both hands resting on his knees, wearing a jacket. I recognized the same oversized men's large that had hung off his narrow shoulders like a tent at the bus stop. Next to him, Nadia Colton sat with the composed alertness of someone who has made up her mind about something and is not open to being talked back from it. On the seat between them, a small canvas bag with its top folded shut. Eli stood when I came through the door. He carried the gravity of someone considerably older than 12. When he met my eyes, it was with the direct, undeflected gaze of a person who has thought through what they are about to do and has resolved every internal argument against it. "Mr. Alderton," he said, "we found something else from that morning." I looked at Nadia. She gave one small nod. The nod of a woman who had already done her weighing, reached her conclusion, and was present because the decision was behind her, not because she was still arriving at it. "Come on back," I said. "Let's sit." Adrienne's conference room held all 4 of us without crowding. Eli sat with the canvas bag across his lap, and unfolded its top slowly, the way you handle something that might matter, and reached inside. What he brought out was a phone older model, the kind that had been mid-range 5 or 6 years back, and was now past its useful life. Screen cracked across the lower left corner case, scuffed and worn flat. It was in the same trash bag as the clothes and the watch, Eli said, buried under everything else down at the bottom. I didn't spot it at first, because the case is dark and it was wrapped in a piece of cloth. He placed it on the table. The battery was completely dead. I held on to it because it came from the same place as the rest. Miss Nadia told me to keep anything that came from the same bag until we knew why it was there. I looked at Nadia. I charged it last week, she said. I have a charger that fits that model. My mother has the same phone. When it came on, I wasn't planning to go through it. I was going to give it to you and let you take it from there. She paused. But there was a notification on the lock screen. An audio file labeled with a date and a time. She reached into her bag and produced a folded sheet of paper, handwritten notes, her script small and precise. I don't have a phone that can play the file directly, and I didn't want to try moving it in case I damaged something, but I could read the file name through the lock screen. The date on it is from 6 weeks ago. A Tuesday evening. 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday evening. I worked backward through the calendar and arrived at a date that fell 7 days before Celeste had first contacted Detective Mabry's department. Adrienne had been quiet through all of this, building her notes with the concentrated efficiency of someone assembling a legal picture on the fly. She looked up. The phone ended up in that trash bag without the owner meaning to recover it, placed there or it fell in. That makes it abandoned property under Pennsylvania law, which substantially changes the admissibility question. She looked at Eli. You found it. You kept it. You didn't access anything beyond what was visible on the lock screen. Is that right? Yes, ma'am, Eli said. His voice was even. And you, Miss Colton, you charged the device but did not unlock it or access any content beyond what appeared on the notification screen. That's correct, Nadia said. I didn't have the passcode. I wouldn't have used it even if I did. Adrienne nodded and looked at me. I'm going to have this looked at by a digital forensics firm I use regularly. They can extract the audio file, document the chain of custody properly, and produce a certification of authenticity that will hold up to challenge. She lifted the phone with 2 fingers and slid it into a clear evidence bag she took from her briefcase. If the content of that file is what the timeline leads me to think it might be, we need everything handled correctly from here. She stepped out to make the call. Eli looked at me across the table. His hands were back on his knees, the same position as in the waiting area. A stillness that was not anxiety, something closer to patience, the kind that belongs to someone who has learned that waiting and being passive are not the same thing. Did I do the right thing? He asked. It was the same question he had asked me at the bus stop that first morning. The same 4 words, the same quiet sincerity from a 12-year-old boy who had nothing and had been going through other people's discarded things looking for food. That morning, he found that bag. The question held a weight that had nothing to do with the phone or the audio file or the legal proceedings now in motion. I looked at Eli, at his too large jacket, his careful hands, the steadiness of his gaze, and felt the particular uncomplicated gratitude of someone who has been helped in a way they could never have arranged for themselves. Yes, I said. You did exactly the right thing. Nadia released a breath, slow, quiet. The exhale of someone who has been holding tension at a manageable level for longer than was comfortable. She looked down at the table for a moment, then back at me. He kept everything, she said. Every single item from that bag. I told him to because something felt off to me, but he would have done it regardless. That's who he is. Eli looked at the table when she said it, wearing the expression of someone receiving a compliment and not quite knowing where to put it. Adrian came back into the room 9 minutes later. "The forensics firm can prioritize this," she said, settling into her chair. 72 hours for a full extraction and authentication report. She looked at me steadily. "Conrad, if this is what the timeline points to, it may be a recording captured on the device during a conversation that took place while the phone was in someone's pocket or bag picking up audio without the speaker knowing it was happening. That falls under accidental recording law. Pennsylvania recognizes accidental recordings as admissible in civil proceedings and under specific conditions in criminal proceedings as well, provided the person who recovered the recording did not deliberately cause it." She set her pen down. "Eli didn't cause anything. He found a phone in a trash bag." "How long until we know what's on it?" I asked. "Thursday," she said. "Friday at the latest." I nodded. I looked at Eli and Nadia, the boy in the too large jacket, and the woman who had been feeding him cranberry scones and looking after him with the uncomplicated decency of someone who helps because helping is available to them. And I understood with a clarity that arrived whole rather than assembled piece by piece that these two had just handed me the thing that would end this. Not the forged document, not Burton's testimony, not Nadia's account of the corner booth meetings. Those were components. That phone was the heart of it. A Tuesday evening 6 weeks back, something had been recorded on that device without anyone intending it, and it had spent every day since then sitting in a canvas bag beneath Eli's bench at the Hartwell Avenue bus stop, while Celeste lodged a complaint with the Philadelphia Police Department, while Owen went into a station and gave statements against his own father, while the entire structure she had erected kept humming along as though it existed in a sealed room. It did not exist in a sealed room. A hungry 12-year-old in shoes 2 sizes wrong had been an accidental witness to all of it. He had held on to what he found for 2 reasons. Something about it didn't sit right, and a woman pulling morning shifts at a small cafe had advised him to preserve anything from the same source until the meaning of it became clear. "Thursday," I said. Adrian nodded. "Thursday." The forensics report landed in my secure inbox Thursday morning at 9:41. Adrian's message underneath the attachment was 7 words. "Read this before you call me, then call me." I opened it at my desk door, shut phone turned face down. The firm 3 people Old City office retained by Adrian on 2 earlier matters had pulled the audio file from the recovered device, assembled a complete chain of custody record, running from Eli's canvas bag all the way to their lab bench, and delivered a 21-page authentication report, establishing that the recording was unmodified. No editing, no compression, no alteration of any kind following the moment of capture. The file ran 43 minutes. Its timestamp placed the start at 7:12 on that Tuesday evening, triggered by the phone's built-in voice memo application, a feature on that model that engaged automatically upon detecting sustained sound above a certain decibel floor. The forensics team's best reconstruction, the phone was tucked inside a jacket pocket or a bag, and the ambient noise of voices in a room had tripped the sensor. Nobody pressed record. The room did it for them. The voices belonged to Celeste, and a man whom the report identified through cross-referencing against a voice sample drawn from a publicly filed court document as Sheldon Wexler. I ran his name while I kept reading. Philadelphia County Court records showed 2 civil judgments against him over the past 8 years, both stemming from disputed lending. His registered business, SWX Capital Management, carried no employees on file and gave no physical address other than a P.O. box in Skokie. He was the private lender Owen owed $83,000. The recording's transcript filled 11 pages. I won't set it out in full here. What those 43 minutes captured Celeste and Sheldon Wexler, a room whose acoustics read as tight and enclosed almost certainly, a booth amounted to this, a methodical walkthrough of the schedule for pulling the forged share transfer out of Conrad Alderton's company before anyone noticed the forgery. Burton Lacey's name came up tagged as handled and no longer a concern. Celeste outlined the police complaint she was planning to file down to the specific framing she meant to use, and identified Owen by name as someone who would cooperate as a witness. And then, at the 31-minute mark, Celeste's voice clear, unhurried, no room for misreading. He doesn't need to know the timeline. Just make sure the pressure stays consistent. Nadia Colton had heard those exact words through the cafe wall. Now they existed on tape in Celeste's voice on a recording that had spent 6 weeks, buried at the bottom of a trash bag inside Eli's canvas bag on a bus stop bench on Hartwell Avenue. I dialed Adrienne. She cut in before I got past a syllable. I know. I went through it an hour ago. The Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office has already heard from me. The forged share transfer pulls this into federal jurisdiction. We're past the point where state charges are the ceiling. A pause. Conrad, what we have here is solid. Genuinely solid. But before I take the next step, 2 things still need to happen. Burton Lacey has to go on record formally. A conference room conversation isn't sufficient. And I need the original 1986 partnership agreement from Arnold with his signed statement detailing the signature irregularities. I checked my phone. Burton had tried me twice in the last 3 days. Both calls went to voicemail. He left nothing either time. The calls themselves said everything. I'll deliver both today, I told her. Burton was on the sidewalk outside my building when I got back from the call with Adrian overcoat-buttoned hands pushed into his pockets, breath showing in small white puffs against the November cold. When he made me out coming toward him, something in his bearing shifted, not relief precisely, but the particular quality of a man who has fought through a long stretch of doubt to reach a decision and intends to act on it before the clarity dissolves. I've been sitting with what you said, he told me, skipping any greeting, about the distinction between victim and perpetrator. His voice had more steadiness in it than when he'd sat across from me 2 weeks earlier. I had to look it up myself, needed the legal language in front of me written down unambiguous before I could accept that the definition fit my situation. I studied him, 62 years old, temples gone gray, the canvas lunch bag his wife had stenciled with his initials wedged under one arm because it was 11 in the morning, and he had arrived at work with his lunch, the same as any other day, the habit of someone who anchors himself to routine when the larger circumstances have stopped making sense. And I felt the emotion that English doesn't quite have a word for what it is to watch a person do something that is both genuinely difficult and genuinely right simultaneously. Adrienne has a slot at 2, I said. I'll reach her now. There's one more thing, Burton said. His hand went into his coat and came out with a manila envelope metal clasp standard issue. Every document she put in front of me, every instruction she sent by text or email, I kept copies. Photographed them with my personal phone and routed the images to a private account she had no knowledge of. He extended the envelope toward me. That's been locked in a compartment in my car for 3 months. I had no clear idea who the right person to hand it to was, or how to do it. Holding on to it was the one thing I felt certain about. I took it from him. It had more weight than its size suggested. Burton, I said. What kept you from bringing this to me earlier? His lips pressed together briefly. Cold air moved in the gap between us. Shame, he said. Not over what she put me through, over what I permitted. Those aren't the same thing, and I had to arrive at that distinction on my own before I could stand in front of another person and say it plainly. I held his gaze. Then I made the call to Adrienne. Arnold arrived at Adrienne's office at 1:45, 15 minutes before Burton, with the 1986 partnership agreement sheathed in the same document sleeve it had occupied since the Clinton administration. He had also prepared a 2-page handwritten statement, composed in the neat block capitals he reserved for things that carried weight, laying out his examination of the forged signature, the precise anomalies he had found in the letterform loops, and the V-shaped scratch on the Rolex crystal that he himself had made 33 years ago, which grounded his expert familiarity with the original piece. He placed the statement on Adrienne's conference table and ran his palm across it to flatten it. 68 years old, he told Adrienne before she could ask. 33 years in the trade. I've been called as a document and materials expert in 4 civil proceedings. If written credentials would be useful, I can get them to you by first thing tomorrow. Adrienne read the statement, then looked up at Arnold with the expression of a lawyer who has been handed something of higher quality than she had been hoping for. Mr. Quentin, she said, these credentials are excellent. I appreciate you coming in. Burton walked in at exactly 2 o'clock, same coat, no lunch bag. He settled in across from Adrienne and talked for 1 hour and 14 minutes. No pauses for prompting his voice, carrying the steadiness of a man who has weighed what silence costs against what speaking costs, and arrived at a number he could live with only on one side. He laid out every exchange he'd had with Celeste, the documents, the threats, the step-by-step instructions with names, figures, dates, and places attached to each one. He described the evening he stood alone in his office at 6 o'clock and photographed those documents on his phone, not knowing whether what he was doing was the most responsible act of the past 7 months or the thing that would unravel him. It proved to be the most responsible act. When the last word was out, Adrienne put her pen down on the table. She looked across at Burton with the plain, unadorned respect of someone in one demanding profession, acknowledging the courage it took to do what he had done. Mr. Lacey, she said, I want to be clear with you about something. The conduct you've described, the coercion, the threats, the exploitation of a prior professional error to compel your participation constitutes criminal extortion under Pennsylvania law. You are the victim of that crime. My recommendation to the Assistant U.S. Attorney will reflect that fully and without qualification. Burton nodded. Both palms rested flat and steady on the table. And the error from 2018, Adrienne continued, meeting his eyes, that was a methodological irregularity in a rounding adjustment that produced no material misstatement, and one that your employer, she glanced briefly at me, has no intention of pursuing. Burton closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When they opened, his face had changed. Not relief, exactly, more the look of someone who has put down a load they carried so long that standing upright without it no longer feels entirely familiar. Beyond Adrienne's window, the November sky had settled into the particular flat gray of a Philadelphia afternoon, suspended between overcast and snow, unable to commit to either. Arnold was at the credenza, refreshing his coffee. Burton was working the buttons of his overcoat. Adrienne had already turned her attention to the notes she was assembling for the Assistant U.S. Attorney's office. And somewhere on the north side of the city, in a gold-gated house on Sycamore Lane, a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years constructing something elaborate was about to learn that everything she had built it on was gone. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. This story asked a great deal of the telling, and maybe of you too. Looking back now, what strikes me most is not the fraud itself or the legal machinery that finally dismantled it. It's the cost of the years before any of that. The cost of watching and not yet knowing. The cost of a son who was terrified rather than dishonest, and a father who had to hold both truths at the same time. I believe God places certain people in the right place at the right moment, a boy at a bus stop, a neighbor with thin walls, a watchmaker who notices what others miss, and that those small, unlikely intersections are never entirely accidental. Here is what I take from it, and what I'd offer to anyone carrying something similar. If someone's story keeps shifting, pay attention to what stays the same underneath. That's where the truth lives. When a person leverages your deepest fear against you, it isn't weakness that got you there. It's love. Don't confuse the two. Document quietly, speak carefully. Let patience be the sharpest thing in the room. And if you are ever used as an instrument against someone you care about, know that the moment you step forward is also the moment you stop being a tool. This has been a family revenge story that I hope stays with you, not for the drama of it, but for what it shows about endurance, precision, and the slow work of doing right by the people you love. Stories like these, the grandpa stories, and the father stories, and the stories of ordinary people navigating extraordinary betrayal, are the ones that remind us we are not alone in what we carry. If this one moved, you please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they matter to me. And if you haven't already, I'd be glad to have you subscribe to Calm Family Revenge, so these stories find you when they're ready. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take good care of yourself.